On the 29th of May, 1453, a 21-year-old sultan stood before walls that had defied armies for 1,000 years, and when those walls finally broke, so did an entire age of human history. The Roman world ended that day, but the empire that replaced it had begun as nothing more than a handful of horsemen on a dusty frontier, and it would endure for 6 centuries, governing 3 continents, 36 sultans passing the sword of Osman from hand to hand across an unbroken chain of power. This is that complete story. From the Turkic riders who swept out of Central Asia and shattered the gates of Anatolia at Manzikert, through the founding of a tiny principality in the hills near Suut, to the conquest of Constantinople and the golden reign of Suleiman. From the intricate machinery of empire, its palaces and bazaars and caravanserais, to the lives of Janissaries, merchants, women, and scholars who filled its cities. From the long centuries of transformation, reform, and resistance, through world war and dissolution, to the republic that rose from the ashes and the legacy that still shapes borders, faiths, and identities from Sarajevo to Sanaa. More than 24 modern nations trace their boundaries to Ottoman maps. Hundreds of millions of people live within structures this empire built, pray in its mosques, walk its streets, carry its memory. This is not distant history. It is the architecture of the present world. If you find meaning in following the complete arc of civilizations that shaped our world, consider subscribing. Each journey we undertake here traces the full life of an empire, from its first breath to its lasting echo. Now let us begin where empires always begin, not with thrones, but with open land and restless peoples moving toward an uncertain horizon. The grass sea stretches without boundary, across the high plateaus of Inner Asia, where the Altai Mountains give way to endless rolling steppe. The wind carries the smoke of felt-covered tents and the low thunder of horses moving in great herds. This is the world that shapes the Turkic peoples, a world measured not in walls or written deeds, but in distance, in the rhythm of seasonal migration, in the bond between rider and mount. For centuries before any sultan sits upon any throne, these pastoral communities drift westward in slow generational waves, pressed by drought, drawn by rumor of richer pasture, pushed by the expanding power of rival confederations along the Chinese frontier. By the middle of the 11th century, one branch of this vast Turkic migration has coalesced into a formidable military and political force. The Seljuk clan, claiming descent from a warlord named Seljuk, who converted to Islam around the late 10th century, forges a confederation of Oghuz Turkmen warriors that sweeps through Persia and Mesopotamia. They seize Baghdad in 1055, and their leader Tughril Beg receives the title of Sultan from the Abbasid Caliph, a partnership of Turkic military power and Arab Islamic spiritual legitimacy that will echo for centuries. But the event that reshapes the entire eastern Mediterranean unfolds on a hot August afternoon in 1071. At Manzikert, near the shores of Lake Van in eastern Anatolia, the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan meets the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes in pitched battle. The Byzantine army, weakened by internal treachery, collapses. Romanos himself falls captive. The defeat does not immediately destroy Byzantium, but it shatters the imperial frontier. Anatolia, for 1,000 years a Greek-speaking Christian heartland, lies open. Turkmen bands pour through the broken border in the decades that follow, settling valleys, occupying towns, transforming the demographic fabric of the peninsula within a single generation. In Konya, the Seljuks of Rum establish a sultanate of remarkable sophistication. Persian serves as the language of court and poetry. Grand caravanserai rise along trade routes, their carved stone portals sheltering merchants traveling between the Mediterranean and the Iranian plateau. Mosques with soaring minarets mark the new Islamic presence across a landscape still dotted with Byzantine churches. The Sultanate thrives through the 12th and early 13th centuries, absorbing Persian administrative culture, patronizing scholars and mystics, minting coins that circulate from the Aegean to the Euphrates. Then the Mongols come. In 1243, at Köse in northeastern Anatolia, the Mongol army annihilates the Seljuk forces. The Sultanate survives in name, but becomes a Mongol vassal, hollowed from within. Over the following decades, central authority dissolves. By the 1260s and 70s, Anatolia fractures into a patchwork of small Turkmen principalities, the Beyliks, Germian, Karaman, Aden, Menteşe, Saruhan, Kandar. Each commands a pocket of territory, each led by a warrior chief, balancing tribal loyalty, Islamic piety, and opportunistic expansion. Along the far northwestern edge of this shattered landscape, where Anatolia's rolling hills descend toward the Sea of Marmara and the weakened Byzantine frontier, the conditions are most volatile and most promising. Here, Ghazi warriors, fighters motivated by faith, plunder, and the prestige of frontier combat, gather in loose bands. Sufi dervishes wander among them, holy men from the Bektashi and other orders, binding communities together through shared devotion and mystical practice. The frontier is porous. Christians and Muslims trade, intermarry, and fight in shifting patterns. Byzantine border lords sometimes ally with Turkmen chiefs against their own emperor. It is in this charged borderland, sometime in the closing decades of the 13th century, that a small beylik begins to distinguish itself from its neighbors. Its territory is modest, the hills around Söğüt and Domanich, a day's ride from the ancient Byzantine city of Nicaea. Its people are herders and raiders, unremarkable among the dozens of similar groups scattered across western Anatolia. Yet something in the geography, the timing, and the quality of leadership converging in this obscure corner will prove decisive. The frontier awaits its transformation. The hills around Söğüt rise gently from river valleys, thick with walnut and plane trees, a landscape of modest elevation but immense strategic consequence. To the northwest, barely 100 kilometers distant, the ancient walls of Nicaea still stand under Byzantine control. To the west, the rich Bithynian plain slopes toward the Sea of Marmara and the great prize of Bursa, a city famed for its thermal springs and silk markets since Roman times. This is the territory where Osman, son of Ertuğrul, begins consolidating a beylik that will outlast every dynasty of its age. Osman's rise is gradual, not sudden. Through the 1290s and into the early 1300s, he expands his domain not through a single dramatic conquest, but through patient accumulation, absorbing neighboring Turkmen clans through marriage alliances, attracting warriors with the promise of plunder from Byzantine border towns, and offering protection to peasant communities regardless of faith. His authority rests on personal charisma, military success, and the Ghazi ethos of frontier holy war, but also on pragmatic tolerance. Greek-speaking Christians farm the valleys his warriors patrol. Some convert, many do not. The beylik grows because it incorporates rather than expels. The coinage minted under Osman's name, small silver akçe pieces bearing simple inscriptions, marks the transition from tribal chieftain to sovereign ruler. By tradition, the Ottoman Principality dates its formal founding to around 1299, though the precision of this date reflects later chroniclers' desire for a clean origin. What matters is the substance. By the early 14th century, Osman commands a territory large enough and organized enough to threaten major Byzantine cities. Osman dies around 1326, the same year his son Orhan completes the long siege of Bursa. The capture of this wealthy city transforms the beylik utterly. Bursa becomes the first true Ottoman capital, its thermal baths and commercial infrastructure providing revenues that dwarf anything the frontier hills could generate. Orhan constructs mosques, establishes the first Ottoman madrasa for Islamic legal education, and mints coins of higher quality. The green-tiled tombs of Osman and Orhan, nestled among Bursa's cypress groves, become pilgrimage sites that anchor dynastic legitimacy in sacred geography. Orhan proves as shrewd a diplomat as he is a warrior. He marries Theodora, daughter of the Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacuzene, binding his house to the very empire his warriors raid. This alliance opens a fateful door. In 1354, Ottoman forces cross the Dardanelles and seize the fortress of Gallipoli on the European shore, initially as allies intervening in Byzantine civil wars, then as permanent occupiers. The narrow strait, barely a few kilometers wide, separates two continents, and the Ottomans now hold both sides. The crossing into Europe is the pivotal act of early Ottoman history. Thrace lies open, its flat agricultural lands, its road networks leading toward Adrianople and beyond, its fractured political landscape of weakened Byzantine authority and quarreling Balkan lords. Orhan's forces fan out across the countryside, establishing garrisons and settling Turkmen colonists in a deliberate policy of demographic transformation. The institutions taking shape in these decades blend three traditions. Turkic custom governs succession and military organization. Persian administrative language and bureaucratic practice provide the vocabulary of governance. The terms for chancellor, treasury, and provincial authority all carry Persian roots. Islamic law, interpreted through Hanafi jurisprudence, structures courts, inheritance, and commercial regulation. The Timar system begins to emerge. Land grants awarded to cavalrymen in exchange for military service, creating a self-sustaining provincial army that requires no central treasury to pay. Each Timar holder collects agricultural revenue from assigned villages and in return appears mounted and armed when summoned. By the time of Orhan's death in 1362, the beylik has become something far greater than a frontier principality. It controls both sides of the Dardanelles, governs a prosperous capital city, maintains diplomatic relations with Byzantium and neighboring states, and administers a growing population of Turks, Greeks, Armenians, and others through increasingly sophisticated institutions. The small domain in the Surt Hills has become an empire in embryo, its appetite for expansion only sharpening as it tastes the wealth and complexity of the lands now falling under its shadow. Murad, the first sultan to bear that name, inherits a realm already stretching across two continents, and he moves immediately to consolidate what his father Orhan began. The Thracian plain lies open before Ottoman cavalry, its Byzantine garrisons undermanned, its fortified towns isolated from any coordinated imperial defense. By 1369, the ancient city of Adrianople falls, not through prolonged siege, but through the systematic reduction of surrounding strongholds that leaves the city without hope of relief. Murad recognizes what the geography declares. Adrianople, soon called Edirne, sits at the confluence of three rivers, commanding roads leading north into Bulgaria, west toward Macedonia, and south to the Aegean coast. He elevates it to capital, shifting the empire's administrative center from Bursa across the straits into Europe. The message is unmistakable. The Ottomans are not raiders passing through, they intend to stay. Edirne transforms rapidly. Mosque complexes rise alongside markets and caravanseries. A new palace takes shape, its courtyards designed for the ceremonial reception of vassals and ambassadors. The city becomes the staging ground for campaigns that push Ottoman borders deeper into the Balkans with each passing year. Sofia falls in 1385. Niš follows in 1386. Serbian, Bulgarian, and Byzantine lords find themselves forced into tributary arrangements or outright submission. It is during these decades that the institution destined to define Ottoman military power takes its mature form. The Devshirme, a periodic levy of Christian boys from Balkan villages, channels young conscripts into conversion, rigorous training, and lifelong service to the Sultan. The most physically capable enter the Janissary infantry corps, disciplined, salaried, forbidden to marry during active service, loyal to the sovereign alone rather than to any provincial lord or tribal chief. They train in barracks complexes, master archery and close combat, and eventually adopt firearms with devastating effect. The Devshirme also feeds the palace school, where the most intellectually gifted boys are educated in languages, administration, and Islamic jurisprudence, emerging as governors and grand viziers. This system produces a governing elite whose power derives entirely from the Sultan's favor, creating a meritocratic counterweight to the old Turkmen aristocracy. The collision between Ottoman expansion and Balkan resistance reaches its climax on the field of Kosovo on the 15th of June, 1389. A coalition of Serbian, Bosnian, and Allied forces under Prince Lazar meets Murad's army on a broad plain, ringed by low hills. The battle is ferocious and its outcome decisive for the region's future. Murad himself is killed, struck down during or immediately after the fighting, but the Ottoman army prevails. Lazar is captured and executed. Serbia becomes a vassal state. The battle enters the collective memory of both Serbs and Ottomans as a defining moment, its significance magnified across centuries of retelling. Bayezid, Murad's son, ascends on the battlefield itself and earns the epithet Thunderbolt for the speed of his subsequent campaigns. He annexes remaining Bulgarian territories, tightens control over Serbian lands, and turns his attention to the Anatolian Beyliks, absorbing rival Turkish principalities with the same aggression he directs at Christian kingdoms. In 1396, a massive crusading army assembled from French, Burgundian, Hungarian, and other European forces marches to halt Ottoman expansion. Bayezid meets them at Nicopolis on the Danube and inflicts a crushing defeat, capturing thousands of knights. Europe recoils. The Ottoman Sultan now blockades Constantinople itself. Yet Bayezid's relentless ambition draws a far more dangerous adversary. Timur, the Turco-Mongol conqueror who has already devastated Persia Mesopotamia and northern India, demands submission. Bayezid refuses. On the 20th of July, 1402, the two armies meet outside Ankara. Timur's force is vastly larger, and critically, several Anatolian Turkmen contingents fighting under Bayezid defect to Timur during the battle, rejoining their former Beylik lords who ride in Timur's ranks. The Ottoman army disintegrates. Bayezid is captured, the first and only Ottoman sultan taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. He dies in captivity within months. Timur's forces sack Bursa, scatter the Ottoman treasury, and restore the Anatolian beyliks to independence. The empire that seemed unstoppable fractures into warring fragments, its survival suddenly and terrifyingly uncertain. 4 sons survive Bayezid, and each claims the shattered inheritance. The decade that follows is the Ottoman interregnum, a civil war fought across Anatolia and the Balkans, where brothers raise armies against brothers, and the dynasty itself hangs by a thread. Suleiman, the eldest, controls the European provinces from Edirne. Isa holds Bursa briefly before Mehmed, based in Amasya, defeats and kills him. Musa crosses into Rumelia and overthrows Suleiman in 1411. For a time, the empire exists as 2 hostile halves, each ruled by a prince who styles himself sultan. The Anatolian beyliks restored by Timur, Karaman, Germiyan, Saruhan, Aydın, watch and wait, content to see the Osmanlı house consume itself. Mehmed, the youngest of the contenders, proves the most patient and the most ruthless. He cultivates alliances with the Byzantine emperor, who provides ships to ferry his troops across the straits. He builds loyalty among frontier commanders who remember his father's conquests. In 1413, his forces corner Musa near Sofia. Musa is killed, and Mehmed enters Edirne as sole ruler. He is Mehmed I, and the empire he inherits is a diminished thing, shorn of its Anatolian buffer states, its treasury depleted, its military prestige shattered. Yet the core remains intact. Edirne still stands as capital. The Balkan provinces still pay taxes. The Devshirme system still produces trained soldiers and administrators. Mehmed spends his 8-year reign in careful restoration. He avoids major wars of expansion, choosing instead to reabsorb the Anatolian beyliks through diplomacy and limited force. He suppresses the rebellion of Sheikh Bedreddin, a radical mystic whose movement threatens the social order in both Rumelia and Anatolia. He rebuilds mosques and markets in Bursa, still scarred from Timur's sack. When he dies in 1421, he leaves a reunified state to his son Murad II. Murad inherits stability but faces immediate challenges. Pretenders emerge. The Karamanid Beylik tests Ottoman resolve. Byzantium, Venice, and Hungary probe for weakness. Murad responds with methodical force, reasserting control over western Anatolia and pressing deeper into the Balkans. He besieges Thessalonica, which falls in 1430. He campaigns in Serbia and Albania, extending Ottoman authority to the Adriatic approaches. The great test comes from the west. In 1443, a crusading alliance forms under the Hungarian king Władysław and the brilliant general John Hunyadi. They drive deep into Ottoman territory, and Murad, who has briefly abdicated in favor of his young son Mehmed, returns to command. On the 10th of November, 1444, the armies meet at Varna on the Black Sea coast. The Crusaders fight with desperate courage, but when Władysław charges the Janissary center and is killed, the Christian army collapses. 4 years later, At the Second Battle of Kosovo in 1448, Murad defeats Hunyadi again, securing Ottoman dominance in the Balkans for a generation. When Murad dies in 1451, his 19-year-old son ascends the throne for the second time. Mehmed II is consumed by a single obsession, Constantinople. The ancient city still stands behind its Theodosian walls, a Christian island surrounded entirely by Ottoman territory. Mehmed begins preparations immediately. In 1452, he orders the construction of Rumeli Hisar, a massive fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly across from the older Anadolu Hisar on the Asian side. The two fortresses together command the narrowest point of the strait, choking off any naval relief from the Black Sea. The fortress rises in barely 4 months, its 3 great towers and curtain walls built by thousands of laborers working through the summer. Simultaneously, Mehmed commissions the Hungarian cannon founder known as Orban to cast bombards of unprecedented size. The largest requires 60 oxen to transport and fires stone balls weighing over half a ton. Ottoman shipyards at Gallipoli produce a fleet to blockade the city from the sea. Troops gather from every province. By the spring of 1453, an army of perhaps 80,000 assembles before the ancient walls, and a fleet of over 100 vessels seals the approaches. Constantinople, defended by fewer than 10,000 men, awaits the assault that will end an empire 11 centuries old and begin another that will endure for nearly 500 more. The bombardment begins on the 6th of April, 1453, and it does not relent. The great cannon of Orban fires 7 times a day, each detonation shaking the earth for miles, each stone ball slamming into the Theodosian walls with a force no fortification in history has been designed to withstand. Dust rises in pale columns above the triple line of defenses that have protected the city for 1,000 years. Sections of the outer wall crumble, are repaired overnight by desperate defenders hauling rubble and timber, and crumble again the following morning. For 53 days the siege grinds forward. Ottoman engineers drag ships overland on greased logs, bypassing the great chain across the Golden Horn, placing vessels inside the harbor where no enemy fleet was ever meant to sail. The final assault comes before dawn on the 29th of May. Wave after wave strikes the walls. Irregular troops first, then Anatolian regulars, then the Janissaries in disciplined ranks, their drums and horns filling the darkness. A small gate called the Kirkaporta is found open or forced open. Janissaries pour through. Along the walls, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, falls fighting among his soldiers. His body is never conclusively identified. By mid-morning, Ottoman banners fly from the towers. The city that had been the capital of Roman civilization for 1123 years passes into Ottoman hands. Mehmed II rides through the shattered gate of St. Romanus that same afternoon. He is 21 years old. He proceeds directly to the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, its vast dome still intact above a nave littered with refugees. He orders the building preserved, consecrated as a mosque. Workers whitewash the Christian mosaics, raise a wooden minaret, orient a mihrab toward Mecca. The structure's colossal engineering, its dome spanning more than 30 meters, its cascading half-domes and 40 windows flooding the interior with light, now serves a new faith within the same astonishing shell. The Sultan understands that a capital requires people. Constantinople's population has dwindled to perhaps 50,000. Mehmed issues decrees compelling resettlement. Muslims from Anatolia, Greeks from the Aegean Islands, Armenians from eastern provinces, Jews welcomed from across the Mediterranean. Each community receives designated neighborhoods. Within 2 decades, the population surpasses 100,000, making it again the largest city in Europe. Construction reshapes the skyline. The Fatih Mosque complex, built between 1463 and 1470 on the site of the ruined Church of the Holy Apostles, becomes the empire's first great imperial kuliya, a mosque surrounded by 8 madrasas, a hospital, a caravanserai, a public kitchen feeding thousands daily, and a library. Nearby, the Grand Bazaar takes form as a covered market of vaulted stone corridors, eventually growing to house thousands of shops beneath lead-covered domes. On the promontory overlooking the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, Topkapi Palace rises, not a single monumental building, but a series of courtyards, pavilions, gardens, and kiosks spread across the ancient Acropolis, a palace conceived as a walled city within a city. Mehmed does not rest. His armies reduce Serbia by 1459. The Morea falls by 1460. Trebizond, the last remnant of Byzantine sovereignty on the Black Sea coast, surrenders in 1461, extinguishing the final successor state of Rome. Bosnia is conquered in 1463. A long war with Venice stretches from 1463 to 1479, ending with Ottoman control of the Aegean and Venetian tribute payments. Otranto in southern Italy is briefly seized in 1480, sending shockwaves through the Italian peninsula. The Sultan who accomplishes all of this governs through relentless personal energy and a reorganized state apparatus. He codifies imperial law in the Kanunname, establishing hierarchies of office, court protocol, and punishment with systematic precision. The Grand Vizier becomes the operational head of government, presiding over the imperial council in the second courtyard of Topkapi, while the Sultan listens from behind a latticed window. Merit, enforced through the Devshirme system, determines advancement more than birth. Mehmed dies on the 3rd of May, 1481, on campaign, possibly marching toward Egypt, possibly toward Italy. He is 49. He leaves behind a transformed world. The city he conquered is no longer Constantinople in Ottoman usage, but Istanbul, a name derived from a Greek phrase meaning simply, to the city. It is already becoming the gravitational center of an empire that stretches from the Danube to the Euphrates, and the building has only begun. Bayezid II, who succeeds his father, is a sultan of a different temperament, contemplative, pious, inclined toward scholarship and Sufi mysticism rather than relentless conquest. His reign of 31 years, from 1481 to 1512, is a period of consolidation rather than expansion. The empire digests its enormous gains. Istanbul's population swells past 200,000 as Bayezid welcomes Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, granting them settlement rights that enrich the capital's commercial and intellectual life. New mosque complexes rise along the Golden Horn. The fleet grows. But the Sultan's caution breeds frustration among his sons, and the most ruthless of them, Selim, forces his father's abdication in 1512. Bayezid dies weeks later on the road to retirement, and Selim ascends the throne, having already eliminated his brothers. Selim I earns the epithet the Grim, and his 8-year reign reshapes the empire's geography more dramatically than any period since the conquest of Constantinople. He turns east first, confronting the Safavid Shah Ismail, whose Shia missionaries have been stirring rebellion among Anatolia's Turkmen tribes. At Chaldiran in 1514, Ottoman cannon and disciplined Janissary musket fire shatter the Safavid cavalry on the plains of northwestern Iran. The victory secures eastern Anatolia and establishes a sectarian frontier that will define Ottoman-Persian rivalry for centuries. Then Selim pivots south. In 1516, his armies sweep through Syria, defeating the Mamluk Sultanate at Marj Dabik near Aleppo. By 1517, Cairo itself falls. The conquest is staggering in its implications: Egypt's grain wealth, the revenues of the Red Sea spice trade, and custodianship of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina all pass to Ottoman control. The empire nearly doubles in size in 3 years. Selim dies in 1520, possibly of cancer, leaving his only surviving son an inheritance that spans 3 continents. Suleiman ascends the throne at 25, and the world he inherits is already immense. What he builds upon it earns him the title the Magnificent in Europe and the lawgiver among his own people. Belgrade falls in 1521. Rhodes, the fortified island stronghold of the Knights Hospitaller, surrenders after a prolonged siege in 1522. Then comes Hungary. On the rain-soaked plain of Mohacs in 1526, the Ottoman army annihilates the Hungarian forces in barely 2 hours. King Louis II drowns fleeing the battlefield. Hungary fractures into Ottoman, Habsburg, and Transylvanian zones that will persist for over a century. 3 years later, Ottoman armies stand before Vienna. The siege of 1529 tests the limits of logistics. Supply lines stretched across the Balkans through autumn rains prove unsustainable, and Suleiman withdraws. Vienna holds, but the message resonates across Europe. Ottoman power now reaches the heart of the continent. At sea, Hayreddin Barbarossa, the corsair admiral whom Suleiman appoints Capudan Pasha, transforms the Ottoman navy into the Mediterranean's dominant force. The victory at Preveza in 1538 secures Ottoman naval supremacy for a generation. North African coastlines from Algiers to Tripoli fall under Ottoman suzerainty. Within the empire, Suleiman codifies law with a comprehensiveness that earns him the title Kanuni. His legal reforms harmonize Sultanic decree with Islamic jurisprudence, regulating taxation, land tenure, criminal punishment, and the rights of subjects across dozens of provinces. The chief architect Sinan, himself a Devshirme recruit, begins a career that will produce over 300 structures. The Suleymaniye Mosque, completed in 1557, rises above Istanbul's third hill, its cascading domes and slender minarets framing the Golden Horn in a composition of mathematical precision and spiritual grandeur. Suleiman dies on the night of the 6th of September, 1566, in his tent before the Hungarian fortress of Szigetvar during his 13th military campaign. He is 71. His Grand Vizier conceals the death to maintain army discipline until the succession is secured. The empire he leaves behind governs perhaps 25 million people across southeastern Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa, the most powerful state in the world and the most complex. The empire that Suleiman leaves behind is not governed by the Sultan alone. It is governed by a machine, an intricate, layered apparatus of household, bureaucracy, military, and law that transforms the personal authority of one man into the administrative reality of 3 continents. The mechanism of this machine is visible nowhere more clearly than within the walls of Topkapi Palace, where the architecture itself encodes the hierarchy of power. The palace is not a single building, but a sequence of courtyards, each more restricted than the last. The first courtyard is open to petitioners and soldiers. The second courtyard, shaded by cypresses and plane trees, contains the imperial council chamber, the Divan-e-Humayun, where the Grand Vizier presides over sessions of state 4 times each week. A latticed window set high in the wall connects to the Sultan's private quarters. Through this grille, the sovereign may listen unseen, intervening only when he chooses. The Grand Vizier holds the imperial seal and exercises executive authority in the Sultan's name, commanding armies, negotiating treaties, dispensing justice. By the mid-16th century, this office has become the most powerful position in the empire after the throne itself, and many who hold it are devshirme graduates, men born Christian in Balkan villages, levied as boys, converted, educated in the palace school, and risen through merit alone. Beyond the second courtyard lies the third, the Enderun, the inner palace where the Sultan lives, studies, and receives only his most trusted advisers. Here, pages trained in languages, calligraphy, horsemanship, and administration serve in graduated chambers, competing for appointment to provincial governorships or central offices. The palace school functions as the empire's most selective academy, producing not only grand viziers, but treasurers, admirals, and governors general. The provinces mirror this structure in miniature. The empire is divided into beylerbeylik units, each governed by a beylerbey who oversees multiple sanjaks administered by sanjak beys. At the foundation of provincial order lies the taimar system, grants of agricultural revenue assigned to sipahi cavalrymen in exchange for military service. A timar holder does not own the land. He collects designated tax revenue from peasant cultivators and in return maintains himself, his horse, and his retainers for campaign season. By the late 15th century, the empire sustains roughly 40,000 Taimar-holding cavalrymen across Anatolia and the Balkans, forming the backbone of the army alongside the salaried Janissary infantry of the capital. Justice flows through a parallel channel. In every town of consequence sits a Qadi, an Islamic judge appointed by the central government, trained in Sharia and the Sultan's Qanun law. The Qadi adjudicates disputes, registers property transactions, enforces market regulations, and serves as the state's eyes in the provinces. Above all Qadi stands the Sheikhul Islam in Istanbul, the empire's chief jurisconsult, whose legal opinions carry the weight of religious authority. Non-Muslim communities operate within the millet system, a framework granting each recognized religious group Greek Orthodox, Armenian Apostolic, Jewish, internal autonomy over personal law, education, and worship. Patriarchs and chief rabbis answer to the Sublime Porte for their community's taxes and conduct, while congregations maintain their own courts for matters of marriage, inheritance, and religious discipline. Churches and synagogues stand within Ottoman cities, their existence regulated but legally protected. Binding all these structures together is the Waqf, the pious endowment. Sultans, viziers, and wealthy individuals establish Waqf foundations that fund mosques, madrasas, hospitals, bridges, fountains, caravanserais, and public kitchens called imarets. These institutions are legally irrevocable, their revenues drawn from designated shops, farms, and bathhouses in perpetuity. By 1580, The Waqf system sustains thousands of charitable and educational institutions across the empire, providing free meals to the poor, lodging to travelers, and education to students regardless of origin. The population it serves numbers between 22 and 25 million souls, a mosaic of Turks, Greeks, Arabs, Slavs, Armenians, Kurds, Jews, and dozens of smaller communities held together not by ethnic unity, but by institutional architecture. The machine does not require love, it requires function, and it functions with remarkable precision. That machine runs on revenue, and revenue runs on trade. The empire's wealth is not abstract, it is tangible, countable, stored in warehouses and weighed on brass scales in covered markets that stretch for entire city blocks. By the late 15th century, Istanbul sits at the center of a commercial web that reaches from the silk workshops of Bursa to the pepper warehouses of Alexandria, from the fur markets of Kaffa on the Black Sea to the coral traders of Algiers. The city itself, approaching 400,000 inhabitants by 1600, is the largest in Europe, and its appetite for goods is insatiable. The Grand Bazaar is the engine room of this appetite. Built in stages after Mehmed the Conqueror's initial Bedesten, a locked, vaulted stone hall for the most precious merchandise, it expands over decades into a labyrinth of more than 60 covered streets and thousands of shops. Goldsmiths cluster in one quarter, leatherworkers in another, textile merchants in a third. Each trade occupies its designated lane, and the spatial order is not accidental. It reflects the guild system, the esnaf, that organizes virtually every craft and commercial activity in Ottoman cities. Guilds regulate quality, set apprenticeship terms, and enforce the nar, the system of fixed prices that imperial inspectors monitor to prevent speculation and hoarding. A baker who sells underweight bread faces public humiliation. A dyer who adulterates his pigments risks expulsion from the trade entirely. Beyond Istanbul, the empire's commercial arteries depend on the caravanserai, the great stone roadside inn spaced a day's journey apart along every major route. These are not private enterprises but Waqf-funded institutions offering free shelter for 3 days to any traveler, merchant, or pilgrim. Their massive courtyards hold hundreds of camels and horses. Their thick walls protect against bandits. From Bursa southward through Konya and across the Taurus passes into Syria, from Edirne westward into the Balkans, these caravanserais ensure that goods flow steadily across vast distances. Bursa remains the empire's silk capital. Raw silk arrives from Iran along routes that predate the Ottomans by centuries, and Bursa's looms transform it into brocades, velvets, and satins that rival anything produced in Venice or Florence. The city's Bedesten hums with transactions conducted in gold and silver coin, and the Ottoman treasury collects customs duties at every stage. Silk is not merely luxury, it is strategic wealth, and the state guards its production jealously. Farther south, the spice trade flows through Ottoman-controlled corridors. After Selim I's conquest of Egypt and the Hejaz, the Red Sea becomes an Ottoman waterway. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and ginger arrive at the ports of Jeddah and Suez, then travel overland to Cairo and onward to Istanbul's Egyptian spice bazaar, completed in 1660. Portuguese competition around the Cape of Good Hope disrupts but never destroys this traffic. Ottoman merchants adapt, and the overland routes retain significant volume well into the 17th century. In the workshops of Iznik, a small town southeast of Istanbul, artisans produce ceramics of extraordinary refinement. Between 1550 and 1620, Iznik potters achieve their supreme mastery: cobalt blue, turquoise, and the famous Armenian bowl red applied beneath a brilliant transparent glaze. These tiles adorn the Suleymaniye, the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, and dozens of imperial buildings. Court designers in Istanbul send paper cartoons specifying exact patterns, and the Iznik kilns execute them with breathtaking precision. Coffee arrives in Istanbul around the 1550s, imported from Yemen through the Red Sea trade. Within a generation, coffee houses proliferate across the capital, hundreds of them by 1600, serving as gathering places where men discuss poetry, politics, and commerce. The authorities periodically attempt to suppress them, fearing sedition, but the coffeehouses survive every ban. They become permanent fixtures of Ottoman urban life, as essential to the social fabric as the mosque or the hammam. The Mediterranean itself is an Ottoman commercial space. Imperial galleys protect merchant shipping, and Ottoman ports from Algiers to Basra handle enormous volumes of grain, timber, textiles, and slaves. Agricultural production on Timar lands feeds the cities, and surplus grain from the Balkans and Egypt flows into Istanbul's granaries by the shipload. The empire does not merely govern territory, it circulates goods through that territory with systematic intent, taxing movement at every node, feeding its capital, and sustaining the vast institutional architecture that holds 25 million people in a single functioning order. Behind the circulating wealth, behind the institutional machinery, there exists another Ottoman world, intimate, enclosed, governed by its own hierarchies. It is the world of the harem, the mosque, the neighborhood street, and the private household, where power wears different faces and daily life unfolds in rhythms that no imperial decree fully controls. The imperial harem of Topkapi Palace is not merely a domestic quarter. It is a political institution of extraordinary complexity, housing the Sultan's mother, his consorts, his children, and hundreds of trained women who serve, educate, and administer within its walls. Iznik tiles in turquoise and cobalt line the chambers. Light filters through latticed windows onto marble floors. The most powerful figure here is not the Sultan's favorite, but the Valid Sultan, the Queen Mother, whose authority over harem appointments, charitable endowments, and dynastic marriages gives her influence rivaling that of the Grand Vizier. Hürrem Sultan, the former slave who became Suleiman's legal wife, transforms this institution. She corresponds with foreign monarchs, commissions major architectural works in Istanbul and Jerusalem, and shapes succession politics until her death in 1558. After her, the pattern deepens. The period scholars call the Sultanate of Women sees figures like Nurbanu Sultan and Safiye Sultan exercise regency-like authority. Kösem Sultan, mother and grandmother of sultans, dominates Ottoman politics for decades until her assassination in 1651. These women operate within Islamic legal frameworks that grant them property rights, inheritance claims, and the ability to establish waqf endowments independently. Beyond the palace, Ottoman society organizes itself through the mahalle, the neighborhood. Each mahallo in Istanbul clusters around a mosque, and the imam serves not only as prayer leader, but as a civil registrar of births, deaths, and moral conduct. Wooden houses with projecting upper stories line narrow streets. Families live in gendered spatial arrangements, with the selamlik receiving male guests and the haremlik sheltering women and children. Women move through the city, shopping, visiting hammams, attending religious gatherings, though veiling customs vary by class and region. Education flows through two channels. The mekteb, attached to neighborhood mosques, teaches children Quranic recitation, basic literacy, and arithmetic. The madrasa, endowed by sultans and wealthy patrons, trains scholars in Islamic jurisprudence, theology, Arabic grammar, logic, and medicine. Madrasa courtyards with domed study cells and central fountains become intellectual centers across the empire, from the Suleimaniye complex in Istanbul to provincial foundations in Damascus and Cairo. Sufi orders permeate every level of society. The Mevlevi dervishes, followers of Rumi, practice their whirling ceremony in tekke lodges where music, poetry, and mystical devotion merge. The Bektashi order maintains deep ties to the Janissary corps, providing spiritual guidance and communal identity to soldiers far from home. These orders offer emotional sustenance, social networks, and alternative paths to divine knowledge that complement the formal religion of the ulama scholars. Ottoman artistic life reaches remarkable sophistication. The Nakashan, the imperial painting workshop, produces miniatures of luminous precision, depicting court ceremonies, military campaigns, and botanical studies on paper prepared with burnished surfaces. Calligraphers elevate Arabic script into visual art, their reed pens shaping the Sultan's tughra and Quranic verses that adorn mosque walls. Poets compose in Ottoman Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, and the greatest among them, Baki, Fuzuli, Nefi, enjoy imperial patronage. Musical traditions crystallize under composers like Itri, whose works for voice and instruments define Ottoman classical music into the 17th century. The hammam anchors public health and social ritual alike. Marble-clad chambers fill with steam rising from heated stone platforms. Men and women attend on separate days or in separate facilities, and the hammam visit becomes an occasion for socializing, negotiation, and celebration. Evliya Çelebi, the tireless 17th century traveler, records these details with encyclopedic devotion, cataloguing Istanbul's hammams, its guilds, its street vendors, its festivals, and its neighborhoods with an intimacy that preserves the texture of Ottoman daily existence as no administrative document can. His 10-volume travel account maps not just geography, but the lived experience of an empire whose social fabric, woven from faith, family, craft, and ceremony, holds together millions of lives across 3 continents in patterns both rigid and remarkably adaptive. But that fabric begins to fray. The death of Suleiman before the walls of Sigetvar in 1566 does not merely end a reign. It closes an era of confident expansion and opens a century of compounding strain. His successor, Selim II, inherits an empire of immense reach but growing rigidity. The Timar system that once sustained provincial cavalry is eroding as inflation, driven by New World silver flooding through Mediterranean trade, devalues fixed land revenues. Janissary ranks swell with men who have never passed through the Devshirme, diluting the corps' discipline and binding it to Istanbul's political intrigues rather than frontier warfare. The long Turkish war against the Habsburgs, grinding on from 1593 to 1606, reveals the depth of the problem. Campaigns in Hungary that once concluded in a single season now drag across years without decisive result. Fortresses change hands and change again. The Peace of Zitvatorok in 1606, negotiated between equals rather than dictated by a triumphant sultan, signals a shift in the European balance that Ottoman diplomats understand, even if the imperial court resists acknowledging it. Far more devastating than any Habsburg army are the Kalali revolts that tear through Anatolia between 1596 and 1610. Displaced soldiers, unpaid provincial troops, overtaxed peasants, and bandit leaders coalesce into armed movements that ravage the heartland. Villages empty. Agricultural land lies fallow. Entire districts of central Anatolia depopulate as families flee toward coastal cities or fortified towns. The countryside that once fed the empire's armies and filled its treasury becomes a landscape of burned granaries and abandoned farmsteads. Order returns only fitfully. Murad IV, ascending the throne as a child in 1623 and seizing personal power by his late teens, proves the last sultan to lead armies in the field with genuine ferocity. He bans coffee, tobacco, and wine, executes thousands to enforce discipline, and in 1638 personally commands the campaign that recaptures Baghdad from Safavid Persia. The Treaty of Zuhab in 1639 fixes the Ottoman-Persian border along lines that endure remarkably into the modern era. But Murad dies in 1640 at 27, and the energy he imposed by sheer will dissipates almost immediately. The middle decades of the 17th century bring the prolonged war for Crete against Venice, lasting from 1645 to 1669, one of the longest sieges in history. Ottoman forces eventually take the fortress of Candia, but at staggering cost in men and treasure. Meanwhile, the Köprülü family of Grand Viziers stabilizes administration through ruthless competence, and for a generation the empire appears to recover its footing. That illusion shatters at Vienna. In 1683, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha leads an enormous army, perhaps 150,000 strong, to the gates of the Habsburg capital. Ottoman siege trenches encircle the city through the summer. But on the 12th of September, a relief force led by the Polish King Jan III Sobieski crashes into the Ottoman lines from the wooded heights of the Kahlenberg. The rout is total. Kara Mustafa is executed by the Sultan's order before the year ends. What follows is catastrophe. The Holy League, Austria, Poland, Venice, and later Russia, presses the offensive across every front. Hungarian fortresses fall in succession. Athens is bombarded. The Morea is overrun. At the Battle of Zenta in 1697, Prince Eugene of Savoy annihilates an Ottoman army crossing the Tisa River. The Treaty of Karlowitz, signed on the 26th of January 1699 in the Serbian town of Sremski Karlovci, formalizes what the battlefield has already decided. Hungary and Transylvania pass to the Habsburgs. The Morea goes to Venice. Podolia returns to Poland. For the first time in its history, the Ottoman Empire cedes vast territories through a negotiated peace imposed by victorious enemies. The diplomats sit across from one another at a long table in a temporary wooden pavilion, and the documents they sign redraw the map of southeastern Europe. The empire remains enormous, stretching from the Danube to the Indian Ocean, but the trajectory has reversed. The frontier that once advanced now contracts, and the question facing Istanbul is no longer how far the empire can reach, but how much of what it holds can be preserved. The question is answered not with confidence but with experiment. In the decades after Karlowitz, the Ottoman state does not collapse, it adapts hesitantly, unevenly, searching for models of renewal even as the old certainties dissolve. The early 18th century brings a pause in major warfare, and within that pause, something unexpected flowers. Ahmed III ascends the throne in 1703, and by 1718, after the Treaty of Passarowitz confirms further losses to the Habsburgs, his Grand Vizier Nevşehirli Ibrahim Pasha turns the empire's gaze inward. What follows is the Tulip period, a decade of cultural refinement, diplomatic curiosity, and cautious openness to European ideas. Along the shores of the Golden Horn, the Sadabad Palace rises amid formal gardens where thousands of tulip varieties bloom in geometric beds, their petals illuminated at night by candles placed on the backs of tortoises wandering among the flowers. The court embraces spectacle, poetry, and a new aesthetic sensibility drawn partly from French models. Ottoman ambassadors travel to Paris and Vienna, returning with observations about European military organization, urban planning, and technology. The most consequential innovation arrives in 1729, when Ibrahim Mutafarrika, a Hungarian convert to Islam, establishes the first Ottoman printing press with movable Arabic type. The press produces maps, dictionaries, and histories, though religious texts remain excluded, reserved for the calligraphers whose craft is considered sacred. The output is modest, perhaps 17 titles in its first decades, but the principle is revolutionary. Knowledge can be reproduced and distributed beyond the manuscript workshop. Yet reform breeds resentment. In 1730, a Janissary-backed revolt led by Patrona Halil erupts in Istanbul. The rebels denounce the court's extravagance and foreign imitation. Ahmed III is deposed, Ibrahim Pasha is executed. The tulip gardens are trampled. The episode reveals a pattern that will repeat for a century. Every attempt at modernization provokes a violent reaction from those whose power depends on the old order. The middle decades of the 18th century bring a far graver threat. Russia, under Catherine the Great, wages war against the Ottomans in 1768, and Russian fleets sail from the Baltic into the Mediterranean, destroying the Ottoman navy at Cheshme in 1770. The Treaty of Küçükkaynarca, signed in 1774, is more damaging than Karlowitz. The Crimean Khanate, an Ottoman vassal for 3 centuries, gains nominal independence, a prelude to Russian annexation in 1783. More ominously, Russia claims the right to protect Orthodox Christian subjects within Ottoman territory, inserting a permanent lever of interference into the empire's internal affairs. Meanwhile, provincial notables, the Ayan, accumulate power in the vacuum left by weakened central authority. In the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Arab provinces, local strongmen control tax collection, raise private armies, and govern with minimal reference to Istanbul. The empire's administrative fabric loosens at every seam. Into this crisis steps Selim III, who takes the throne in 1789, the same year revolution engulfs France. Selim envisions comprehensive reform. His Nizam-e-Jadid, the new order, creates a modern infantry force trained by European officers, dressed in European-style uniforms, drilled in European tactics. New barracks rise outside Istanbul. Revenue reforms attempt to fund the project. Selim dispatches permanent ambassadors to European capitals for the first time. But in 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invades Ottoman Egypt, landing at Alexandria with 36,000 troops. French soldiers camp beneath the pyramids. The invasion shatters the illusion that the empire's distant provinces are secure, and though a combined Ottoman-British campaign eventually expels the French by 1801, the shock reverberates through Istanbul. Selim's reforms, meanwhile, provoke exactly the backlash the Tulip period foreshadowed. The Janissaries, provincial notables, and conservative ulama see the Nizam-ul-Tadid as a direct threat to their privileges and traditions. In 1807, a mutiny erupts. Selim is deposed and imprisoned. His new model soldiers are disbanded. The following year, reformist allies attempt to restore him, but Selim is murdered before they reach the palace. His body is found in a courtyard of Topkapi, and the reform program dies with him, temporarily. The empire has learned that it must change to survive, but it has not yet found a sultan ruthless enough to force that change upon those who resist it. That sultan arrives in the person of Mahmud II. He ascends the throne in 1808, the last surviving prince of the dynasty, elevated amid the chaos of Selim's murder and the brief, doomed reign of Mustafa IV. Mahmud inherits an empire hemorrhaging at every edge, Greece seething with revolutionary fervor, Egypt under the increasingly autonomous Muhammad Ali, Serbia in open revolt, and the Janissary corps entrenched as a political force that makes and unmakes sultans at will. For 18 years, Mahmud watches, waits, and quietly builds. He studies Selim's failure with surgical precision. The mistake was not reform itself, but its timing and its isolation. Mahmud cultivates allies among loyal artillery units, provincial governors, and reform-minded ulama. He secures a fatwa declaring the Janissaries an obstacle to the defense of Islam. On June 15, 1826, when the Janissaries rise in predictable revolt against his new trained regiments, Mahmud is ready. Artillery batteries wheel into position around the Et Meydana barracks in Istanbul. The bombardment begins. Flames consume the ancient compound. Thousands of Janissaries die in the fire and the street fighting that follows. Thousands more are hunted down, exiled, or executed in the days after. The great cauldrons that symbolized Janissary identity, the overturning of which had signaled every previous revolt, are melted down. Mahmud calls it the auspicious incident. 5 centuries of military tradition end in a single afternoon of smoke and cannon fire. With the Janissaries destroyed, the institutional landscape clears. Mahmud establishes the Asakiri Mansura-i Muhammadiyya, the victorious soldiers of Muhammad, trained along European lines with Prussian advisors. He abolishes the Taimar system, centralizes tax collection, creates new ministries modeled on European cabinets, mandates the fez as headgear to replace turbans and Janissary caps, and sends students to Paris and Vienna. Yet the empire continues to fracture. The Greek War of Independence, fueled by European Philhellenism and Russian intervention, ends in 1832 with an independent Greek kingdom carved from Ottoman territory. Muhammad Ali's modernized Egyptian army invades Syria in 1831 and defeats Ottoman forces so thoroughly that only British and Russian diplomatic intervention prevents him from marching on Istanbul itself. Mahmud dies in 1839, just days before his foreign minister Mustafa Reshid Pasha reads the Gülhane Edict in a rose garden beside Topkapi Palace. This imperial decree inaugurates the Tanzimat, the era of reorganization. It guarantees security of life, honor, and property for all Ottoman subjects regardless of religion. It promises fair taxation, regular military conscription, and public trials. The edict does not emerge from abstract idealism. It is calculated to win European diplomatic support and to bind the empire's restive Christian populations to the state through legal equality rather than mere toleration. The Tanzimat unfolds across 2 decades of breathtaking institutional change. New secular courts operate alongside Sharia tribunals. Provincial administration is standardized through the vilayet system. State schools teach French, mathematics, and geography alongside Quranic studies. Telegraph lines stretch across Anatolia by the 1850s, connecting Istanbul to its provinces in minutes rather than weeks. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 brings the empire into alliance with Britain and France against Russia, and Ottoman soldiers fight alongside European armies on the same battlefields. The Treaty of Paris in 1856 admits the Ottoman Empire into the concert of Europe. The Reform Edict of that same year deepens Tanzimat promises, explicitly abolishing the jizya tax on non-Muslims and opening military and civil service to all faiths. Yet reform generates its own contradictions. National consciousness among Balkan Christians is not dampened by legal equality. It is sharpened. Romanian, Serbian, and Bulgarian movements intensify. Meanwhile, the cost of modernization drives the empire into European debt markets. Railroads and telegraph lines are built, but often with foreign capital and foreign concessions. Dolmabahce Palace rises along the Bosphorus shore, its crystal chandeliers and marble staircases a deliberate statement of European modernity. Yet its construction costs strain an already burdened treasury. By the 1870s, fiscal crisis looms. In 1876, amid Balkan uprisings and great power pressure, the reformist Grand Vizier Midhat Pasha engineers the promulgation of the Kanun-i Esasi, the first Ottoman constitution, on December 23rd. It establishes a bicameral parliament and enshrines civil liberties. The empire has remade itself on paper. Whether it can survive the forces that remaking has unleashed remains the defining question of the decades ahead. The constitution lives for barely 14 months. Abdulhamid II, who had accepted its promulgation as the price of ascending the throne, watches the new parliament convene in March of 1877, and watches it criticize his government's conduct of a disastrous war against Russia. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 strips away vast territories. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro gain full independence. Bulgaria emerges as an autonomous principality, and Russia seizes Kars and Batumi in the east. The Congress of Berlin in the summer of 1878 moderates Russia's gains but formalizes the empire's humiliation. Britain takes Cyprus. Austria-Hungary occupies Bosnia-Herzegovina. In February of 1878, citing the emergency of war, Abdulhamid suspends the constitution and prorogues parliament. It will not reconvene for 30 years. From behind the walls of Yildiz Palace, perched on a hilltop above the Bosphorus, the Sultan constructs a system of personal rule more centralized than any his predecessors attempted. An elaborate network of spies and informants, the Hafiya system, extends into every ministry, every barracks, every provincial capital. Telegraph wires, the very instruments of modernization, become tools of surveillance, carrying coded reports directly to the palace. Yildiz itself grows into a self-contained compound. Workshops, a private theatre, a carpentry studio where the Sultan works with his own hands, gardens patrolled by guards. Abdulhamid trusts almost no one. He changes residences within the compound unpredictably, He tastes no food without it being tested first. Yet this autocrat modernizes relentlessly. During his reign, the empire's school system expands dramatically. New military academies, civil service colleges, medical schools, veterinary institutes, and hundreds of primary schools across the provinces. The telegraph network grows to over 30,000 miles of wire. Railroad construction accelerates, and the most ambitious project is the Hejaz Railway, begun in 1900, stretching from Damascus toward Medina through the Arabian Desert, funded partly by donations from Muslims worldwide. It is an engineering feat and a political statement. The Sultan, claiming the title of Caliph with renewed emphasis, positions himself as protector of Islam's holiest sites. But the empire continues to hemorrhage territory. France seizes Tunisia in 1881. Britain occupies Egypt in 1882. Eastern Rumelia unites with Bulgaria in 1885. And within the eastern provinces, escalating tensions between Armenian communities seeking reform and a state fearful of separatism erupt into catastrophic violence. In 1894 to 1896, massacres carried out by Ottoman troops and irregular Kurdish cavalry killed tens of thousands of Armenians across Anatolia, provoking international condemnation that Abdulhamid dismisses as interference. Opposition coalesces in exile and in secret. In 1889, students at the Imperial Military Medical Academy in Istanbul form the nucleus of what becomes the Committee of Union and Progress. Its members, young officers, doctors, bureaucrats, intellectuals, organize clandestinely in cells across the empire, with particular strength in the garrison city of Salonika, where Masonic lodges provide cover for revolutionary meetings. They demand the restoration of the constitution, parliamentary governance, and Ottoman unity across ethnic lines. In the summer of 1908, the movement erupts. Military units in Macedonia mutiny, demanding constitutional restoration. On July 24th, Abdulhamid, faced with the collapse of army loyalty, restores the Kanun-i Esasi. Celebrations sweep Istanbul and cities across the empire. Muslims, Christians, and Jews embrace in the streets, believing a new era of liberty and equality has dawned. But the euphoria is fragile. In April of 1909, a reactionary uprising known as the 31st of March Incident briefly seizes the capital. The committee's forces march from Salonika, suppress the revolt, and on April 27th depose Abdulhamid, exiling him to Salonika under guard. His brother Mehmed V ascends as a constitutional figurehead. The Committee of Union and Progress now holds real power, governing through cabinet ministers and military influence. But the constitutional revolution does not halt the empire's contraction. Italy invades Ottoman Libya in 1911. The committee's leaders, Enver, Talat, Cemal, grow increasingly centralist and nationalist, their original pluralist vision narrowing under the pressure of territorial loss and ethnic fragmentation. The empire they have inherited is smaller, weaker, and more volatile than the one Abdulhamid had held together through fear and cunning. The constitution has been restored, but the forces tearing at the state have only accelerated. In October of 1912, the storm breaks. Montenegro, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece, states the empire had once ruled absolutely, form the Balkan League and attack simultaneously. The Ottoman armies, stretched thin and poorly coordinated, collapse with shocking speed. Within weeks, Bulgarian forces advanced to the Satalka lines barely 40 kilometers from Istanbul itself. Salonika falls to Greece in November. Edirne, the old imperial capital where sultans had once held court, surrenders to Bulgarian siege in March of 1913. Refugee columns choke the roads of eastern Thrace, hundreds of thousands of Muslim civilians fleeing westward, carrying what they can, leaving behind centuries of Ottoman settlement. The Treaty of London in May of 1913 strips away nearly all European territory. A brief Second Balkan War allows the Ottomans to recapture Edirne, but the damage is irreversible. Macedonia, Albania, most of Thrace, gone. The empire that had once besieged Vienna now barely holds a foothold in Europe. The Committee of Union and Progress, humiliated by defeat, consolidates power through a coup in January of 1913. Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Shemal Pasha emerge as a ruling triumvirate, governing behind the constitutional facade. They modernize the army with German military advisors, reorganize provincial administration, and pursue an increasingly Turkish nationalist ideology that alienates Arab, Armenian, and other minority populations. When war erupts across Europe in August of 1914, the triumvirate sees opportunity. On the 2nd of November 1914, the Ottoman Empire enters the Great War alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary, drawn by secret alliance and the promise of recovering lost territories. The war unfolds on multiple fronts with devastating consequences. In the Caucasus, Enver Pasha's ambitious winter offensive against Russia at Sarıkamış ends in catastrophe. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers freeze to death in mountain passes in January of 1915. The regime, blaming Armenian communities for alleged collaboration with Russia, initiates mass deportations beginning in April of 1915. Armenian populations across eastern Anatolia are forced on death marches into the Syrian desert. Systematic killings, starvation, and exposure destroy the vast majority of the Ottoman Armenian population. Estimates of the dead range from 800,000 to 1.5 million. The ancient Armenian presence in Anatolia is annihilated. At Gallipoli, the empire achieves its most celebrated military victory. From February of 1915 through January of 1916, Ottoman forces under the command of German General Liman von Sanders, with Mustafa Kemal commanding the critical heights at Çukurova and Anafartalar, repel the Allied amphibious invasion. The narrow peninsula becomes a slaughterhouse of trenches carved into cliff faces above narrow beaches. The Allies withdraw, having suffered over 200,000 casualties. The Ottomans lose a comparable number, but hold the strait. Yet Gallipoli cannot reverse the wider tide. In June of 1916, Sharif Hussein of Mecca launches the Arab Revolt, supported by British gold and advisors. Ottoman garrisons across the Hejaz come under siege. In Mesopotamia, British forces capture Baghdad in March of 1917. In Palestine, General Allenby enters Jerusalem in December of that year. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 has already secretly partitioned Ottoman Arab lands between Britain and France. By autumn of 1918, the empire is exhausted. The Armistice of Mudros, signed on the 30th of October 1918, ends hostilities. Allied warships anchor in the Bosphorus. British, French, and Italian troops occupy Istanbul. The Treaty of Sèvres, imposed in August of 1920, proposes dismembering Anatolia itself, granting territories to Greece, Armenia, Kurdistan, and European zones of control. The Sultanate in Istanbul, powerless, acquiesces. But in the Anatolian interior, resistance crystallizes. Mustafa Kemal lands at Samsun on the 19th of May, 1919, organizing nationalist congresses at Erzurum and Sivas. On the 23rd of April, 1920, the Grand National Assembly convenes in Ankara, claiming sovereign authority. The Turkish War of Independence rages for 3 years against Greek armies advancing deep into western Anatolia, against Armenian forces in the east, against French troops in Cilicia. The decisive blow falls at Dumlupınar on the 30th of August, 1922, shattering the Greek front. Turkish forces retake Smyrna in September amid catastrophic fire and civilian devastation. On the 1st of November, 1922, the Grand National Assembly abolishes the Sultanate. Mehmed VI, the 36th and last Ottoman Sultan, slips aboard a British warship and sails into exile. 6 centuries of dynastic rule end not with ceremony, but with silence on the waters of the Bosphorus. The silence on the Bosphorus does not last. Within months, a new political order takes shape in Ankara, the dusty Anatolian town that Mustafa Kemal has chosen as his capital, precisely because it carries no Ottoman memory. Diplomats gather at Lausanne in Switzerland, and on the 24th of July, 1923, they sign the treaty that replaces the punitive terms of Sèvres with internationally recognized borders for a sovereign Turkish state. On the 29th of October, 1923, the Grand National Assembly proclaims the Republic of Turkey. Mustafa Kemal becomes its first president. Then, on the 3rd of March, 1924, the Assembly abolishes the Caliphate itself, the spiritual office that Ottoman sultans had claimed since Selim I's conquest of Egypt 4 centuries earlier. Abdülmecid II, the last caliph, departs Istanbul by train, carrying a few suitcases into European exile. The institutional framework of 600 years dissolves in a matter of months. Ankara rises in deliberate contrast to Istanbul. Broad boulevards replace narrow Ottoman lanes. Republican monuments in austere modernist stone stand where no mosque dome competes for the skyline. The new state adopts the Latin alphabet, the Gregorian calendar, the Swiss civil code, and the metric system. The fez is banned. Religious orders are dissolved. The Waqf endowment system that had sustained Ottoman civic life for centuries is nationalized. The rupture is ideological and total, yet Istanbul's skyline, unchanged, still speaks in the Ottoman tongue. The Süleymaniye complex still cascades down toward the Golden Horn. Topkapı Palace becomes a museum. The Grand Bazaar continues to trade. Across the former imperial territories, Ottoman administrative boundaries harden into national borders drawn by European powers. The sanjaks of the Levant become the mandates of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. The vilayets of the Balkans have already fractured into Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Albania, and Romania. In each successor state, more than 24 in total, the Ottoman inheritance is inescapable. Sarajevo's Başçarşıça quarter preserves its Ottoman-covered markets and the Gazi Husrev Beg Mosque built in 1531. Jerusalem's old city walls, raised by Suleiman the Magnificent, still define the sacred precinct. Cairo's historic core retains Ottoman-era houses and fountain complexes layered atop Mamluk foundations. In Athens, in Belgrade, in Bucharest, Ottoman bridges, baths, and clock towers survive, sometimes cherished, sometimes neglected, always present. The collective memory of Ottoman rule fractures along national lines. In Turkey, the relationship oscillates between rejection and reclamation. The early republic suppresses Ottoman cultural forms, yet by the 21st century, television dramas set in the imperial court draw tens of millions of viewers. Restoration projects return Ottoman monuments to their original splendor. Political rhetoric invokes Ottoman greatness. In the Balkans, memory is more contested. Ottoman centuries are remembered as both oppression and coexistence, depending on community and generation. In Arab lands, the narrative often frames Ottoman rule as a period of stagnation preceding national awakening, though scholars increasingly complicate that story with evidence of shared governance and cultural exchange. The Ottoman archives in Istanbul hold over 150 million documents, tax registers, court records, imperial decrees, diplomatic correspondence, population surveys spanning 5 centuries and 3 continents. They constitute one of the largest and most detailed administrative records in human history, and scholars from dozens of countries continue to mine them for insights into everything from climate history to women's property rights. Ottoman cuisine, the layered pastries, the grilled meats, the coffee rituals, remains the shared culinary grammar from the Adriatic to the Persian Gulf. Ottoman musical modes still echo in the folk traditions of Greece, the Arab world, and the Balkans. The millet system's legacy of communal religious autonomy shaped how successor states imagined minority governance for generations. The physical infrastructure of empire, roads, bridges, water systems, marketplaces, still channels the movement of people and goods through landscapes the Ottomans organized centuries ago. The empire is gone, the dynasty is scattered, but the world the Ottomans built, in stone and law, in memory and cuisine, in borders and belief, endures across 3 continents, woven so deeply into the fabric of modern life that it can never be fully separated from the present. Thank you for joining this journey through 6 centuries of Ottoman history. If these stories have deepened your understanding, consider subscribing so you never miss a new exploration of the civilizations that shaped our world.